Welcome to the Humanities Podcasting Symposium panel on interdisciplinary communication.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Jill Fellows. I go by Jill, but if you call me Jennifer, that's fine too. That's what it says, because that's the name I publish under. So, and I'd like to welcome us all to this digital space. But I also want to reflect that digital space is never just digital, it takes up physical space. And so I would like to acknowledge that I am streaming from you currently from the unceded territory of the Kikite people. So I've put a link or the spelling of the Kikite people in the chat. I also wanted to give just some other links of resources if you don't know the land, particularly those of us who are settlers, if you don't know the land that you're on. And I invite other people to share in the chat if they feel comfortable where they're streaming from. So I have Indigenous Peoples of Canada, which is obviously Canada specific. But I also have this one. Oh, that didn't work. Copy and paste fail. Sorry. Nativelands.ca, which I believe covers all of North America. And then since land acknowledgements themselves are only one step, I wanted to just take this opportunity while I have the microphone and the attention to amplify the podcasts of a few Indigenous creators that I follow that I think are really cool. So this first one is called Métis in Space, and it's two Métis women who analyze pop culture from an anti-colonial Indigenous perspective, and it's really, really fun and interesting. And then this other one was actually recommended to me by a couple of students of mine, and it's called Matriarch Movement. And in Matriarch Movement, there are interviews of a number of leadership women in various Indigenous nations across Canada who are kind of being matriarchs for their communities and setting examples. So that's a couple of podcasts I wanted to amplify that you may want to check out in order to learn a little bit more about anti-colonialism and Indigenous activism through podcasts specifically. Cool. So this is a session on interdisciplinary podcasts. And what I wanted to do now was invite the various panelists to talk about their podcast projects, especially with reference to interdisciplinarity. What is the project? Who do you interact with? All those kind of things. I don't have an interdisciplinary podcast. I have background in interdisciplinary education, but I don't currently run an interdisciplinary podcast. So I am also here to learn and I'm very excited. And maybe we'll start with Joe.
You bet. I was just working on my land acknowledgement in the chat, but I'll get back to it.
Yeah, those can just kind of filter in, I think, throughout. I think that would be great.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, hi, everybody.
Recording in progress.
Oh, something funky just happened with
I think the recording just kind of kicked in again.
Oh, okay. Are you hearing me echo? Because I'm hearing myself echo.
No.
Okay, great. Okay, hi again, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm a medical anthropologist at the University of Oregon. And along with my co-hosts, one of whom is here today, Erik Peterson, and one of whom is not, Jim Binden, I host and produce the podcast, Speaking of Race. The three of us, I'm as I said, a cultural anthropologist, Erik is a historian of science, and Jim is a biological anthropologist and human biologist. So we come at questions of sort of the history of race, how it came to be such an important and salient category, and why it won't go away, even though we have tons of evidence against it as a biological reality. And we try to do that from this multidisciplinary sort of social science, biological science, and humanities perspective. So that's the sort of main thrust of the podcast. We have guests all the time from lots and lots of different disciplines. We try to keep our guest list as interdisciplinary as we are. And we also produce a lot of original content, including using the space as sort of like a sounding board for new research that we ourselves are working on.
Cool, thank you. I will turn it over to Elizabeth next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Ferry, and I produce a podcast, I'll put it in the chat, called Recall This Book, along with John Plotz. And we have been working on interdisciplinary things for a long time as colleagues at Brandeis University outside of Boston, and also as friends and interlocutors who like to argue with each other quite a bit. And the sort of original form of the podcast in some ways was the course that we taught together. And when we were planning the course, we realized that we couldn't just show up without arguing some of the questions about what the assumptions of different disciplines were beforehand. So we had a lot of good coffee and wine-fueled discussions. And I think we reproduced that in the podcast. I'm an anthropologist, John is from literature, and we often have a kind of triangular structure where we'll have a biologist or a historian of science or an artist or a political theorist. Usually with a kind of central topic and then different kinds of books or other things that we're sort of reading things through. What's exciting to me about interdisciplinary communication and is both the ways in which you sort of see things more, it's almost like a prismatic kind of situation where you're sort of seeing these different angles, different slants, but also sort of figuring out the ways in which more fundamental differences that one isn't necessarily completely aware of. I remember once playing the game Apples to Apples, if you guys have played it, with John and a friend of his who's also in literature. And I got so mad halfway through because it's like, whenever one of them was the judge, they would invariably pick the other ones because just the way of thinking and the way of, making this argument about why this was a good example of something, I don't know, expensive was, and so I like that too. We encounter these sort of interesting moments in our conversations where suddenly assumptions are revealed as being fundamentally different. And I just find that sort of an ever fresh kind of way of thinking about the world. And so we try, we've done different things on policing, on addiction, on minimalism, all sorts of on art and food, and try to keep it sort of very conversational and kind of constantly discovering those angles.
Cool, thank you. And I really appreciate the comment about how it can serve as like a check on your own discipline or your own disciplinary perspective. So I'm gonna now ask Amanda to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. So I might be in a bit of a unique position because I'm sort of between podcasts. And what I mean by that is I hosted a limited run podcast called The Health Humanist, and I just put the link in the chat. And it was part of a CARES Act NEH grant. So it ran for fall of 20. And it was, the idea was, it was coming out of the health humanities. So sort of the nature of it made it quite interdisciplinary. My background is in literature, but I started the medical and health humanities program at Misericordia University. And so our guests came from sort of all over. That included from medicine, psychology, theater, the arts, literature, history, healthcare lobbyists. And the idea was I hosted it. So it was a narrative-based podcast. So I'd do the interviews and then put it into a sort of a storytelling format. And I would try to pair someone from the humanities from someone not from the humanities so we could have these really interesting conversations. And in some cases, everyone was on the podcast at the same time. That was sometimes challenging because of the number of voices. So editing was always sort of fun because I was doing it on my own. And in some cases, I'd be interviewing people separately, but with either the same questions or if I knew what someone had already said, sort of complementary questions. And so what I appreciated about it was it allowed us to really think about issues in health, COVID related, but beyond that, but all contemporary ones through these multiple lenses. And I think there was a lot of richness to having a healthcare lobbyist talk about voting in health with a doctor who had actually done research on the impact of voting in your health. And when you're a disenfranchised voter, what does that happen to your health? Or having a historian of medicine with someone who does literature in medicine talking about the return of so-called Victorian diseases in the UK and sort of the rise of what we associate with 19th century diseases. So this was a great opportunity to have these kind of rich conversations. And the podcast ran, it was 7 episodes as I said, part of this grant. One of the reasons it ended is I switched to a different job. So I'm no longer at Misericordia. I'm now professor of medical humanities at Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine. So I'm at a medical school, and my colleague Ian McCoog and I are working on developing a new podcast that's going to be looking at history of medicine and contemporary impacts on healthcare.
Cool, thank you. And again, I really like this idea of like bringing different lenses together to maybe perhaps get a more holistic picture than typically happens in kind of the silos of academia. Sharon, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm just trying to think about I'm a little bit of an odd fit for the panel, I guess. I mean, my own training was very interdisciplinary. I have a social and political thought degree. And so I kind of like never inhabit the same conference twice. It's sometimes in poli-sci, sometimes in the MLA or wherever I end up. But the podcast I'm working on is, it emerged out of a partnership with a museum. The Museum of London approached me they were doing a big COVID collection project, Museum London, UK. And they wanted to collect dreams as part of that COVID collection project. And I work on dreams. And so we got talking, and then we started developing a project where we spoke to the public about their COVID dreams. They put a call out, and we got like thousands of people respond. And so then I thought, well, this would make these interviews, which are about an hour, went into the permanent collections as testimony about COVID. But then we thought, well, it might be fun to try to develop these podcast episodes out of those conversations. And so I happened to have a student who was a podcaster professionally. And so she's been editing it. I mean, although I write the scripts for it, and I have a little bit of commentary. But then I also have a composer, which has been fantastic. So each episode is about one dreamer, so to speak. Although the last one we did was about a mother-daughter, and that was so fun, a 9-year-old who had amazing dreams. And the composer writes a theme for each of the dreamers, and then we develop it, and we talk about the music and talk about the content of their dreams. And sometimes we bring in little clips we try to meet them. So my sense of interdisciplinarity is not so much interdiscipline as opposed to what it means to try to meet someone else's discourse, I guess, and their imaginary life. So if we had one dreamer who was a young woman of color living in East London who had a dream about the death of a Black man. And this was within the few months of George Floyd. And so we had a long conversation about how to think about music there and what kind of, how to meet the content of her imaginary life. So it's been, and one guy who I really didn't like, and trying to kind of work with his testimony in a way that was respectful. He was very interested in neuroscience, so we brought a neuroscientist in to kind of be a talking head in relation to him. So it was I'm interested in that, how to have these kinds of meetings that are not necessarily directly in conversation. I was thinking about what you just said, Amanda, about these. Do you have people that are actually in conversation with each other, or other ways of developing the structure of a podcast that is about putting people into conversation without doing that directly, so to speak?
That's really interesting. Thanks. And I'll just say, in my own interdisciplinary education, I found working with composers and scholars in music to be some of the most challenging and most rewarding. I'm trained as a philosopher, so I don't tend to think that way. And I've found it really, really cool. So I'm super interested, and I may have more questions for you. Aliz, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Aliz Horvath. I am an assistant professor in East Asian history and digital humanities. I currently work at Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, so I'm zooming from Hungary at the moment. But I did my PhD at the University of Chicago. And I run a podcast called Humanista, the podcast. I'll put it in the chat. And so the focus of this podcast is to show the role and to explore the role and significance of the humanities in the 21st century, and what we can learn about the world through humanistic lens. And because I consider one of the most important advantages and the beauty of the humanities, its diversity. I think that's one of the most important things that I enjoy in humanities, that it's so diverse. So this is what this is why and how my podcast became interdisciplinary one way or the other. So it just happened automatically. So I've always considered this platform a good way to talk to people who I was interested in, even if they are not in my field. So I've always made a point at being independent. So this is not related to any institution, and it's not area specific either, in a sense that although I'm in East Asian studies, a lot of the times I talk to people who are in completely different fields, from ethnomusicology to art history, library science, information design, and so on. So, yeah, and just one more thing. So one of the reasons why I conceptualized this project was, so I started it when I was still in Chicago, although the idea came to my mind when I was doing dissertation research in Japan. So one of the things that motivated me to do this was the fact that I still see in the media and even sometimes around me, I hear people make some, I wouldn't say derogatory comments, but some ambivalent and, let's say, interesting comments about the value of the humanities or what humanists can bring to the table. And sometimes this is not really clear to a number of individuals. And one thing that I realized, or at least that's been my impression, is that sometimes this stems from the lack of information. So these people just don't have enough knowledge about what humanists really do. And even though I think humanists are really everywhere, so people with humanistic backgrounds can be found in any industry, in any area, in any field. And this is part of the reason why I thought giving more visibility to these areas and fields and people who work in these different areas would be a good idea.
Yeah. And actually, Aliz, thanks, because that kind of leads us into one of the first things we said we wanted to talk about. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I thought you were done, but I think it was just an audio problem on my end. I apologize.
Yeah. No, I just. Yeah, I was done. I was done.
Oh.
No. I was done. Okay, I'm done. It's just that I got froze a little bit. Okay, I was done.
Yeah, so that kind of leads into one of the first things we said we wanted to talk about, which was thinking about who your audience is and when you're developing these interdisciplinary podcasts. So thinking about how an intended audience shapes your approach, or who the audience is that you're conceiving for these, because these aren't going to be discipline specific, right? So given that Aliz just kind of raised this issue of wanting to raise the profile of the humanities, Aliz, do you want to start us off on this discussion of intended audience?
Yeah, this is one of the trickiest questions that we had in advance to prepare for. Well, I have to say that for me, because I covered such a broad, for me, it was a conscious decision to try to speak to as broad an audience as possible. So it has a slightly public humanities layer to this project as well. I have to say that I don't really have a sense of who actually listens to this podcast. So I don't use any software to analyze who actually tunes into this, but I still remember when I launched the podcast, I literally said that if one person listens to it, it's that way more than one person listens to it. But okay. Oh.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I had a bit of trouble with the audio there.
Okay.
Aliz, I shut your video off because I thought it might help us hear you better, if that's okay.
Okay, fine. All right. Okay. It's completely fine. So yeah, so but in general, I think I have said everything for now. Maybe something else will come to my mind. But again, just one more thing. So when I started this podcast, so I did not start it because I wanted to be an influencer and just spread the word about the humanities. So it just started off as a side project for me. But eventually, one thing I noticed, and this is how I know who actually listens to it, is because people just come to me if we know each other in person, or people sometimes message me on Twitter and they tell me that they listen to it from Asia, and it's just so inspiring for them to hear about European scholars and about their experience, because this is something that they have very limited experience about or knowledge about. So this is how I get to hear some fractures of information about who actually listens to this, but it's not really like a conscious decision from my part in terms of who I want to target. Anyone who's interested in this.
Cool. This may be dangerous with a panel this big, but does anybody else want to just respond about intended audience rather than me kind of going through and picking on people? Yeah, Joe.
This is something I think that we probably all of you struggle with quite a lot, because of the nature of podcasting as a mostly open source thing. Anybody could theoretically be listening to what you put out there. And also we found that the ability to track listeners, even numbers of listeners, is hard across platforms, because people can get your podcast from all over the place. So I'm sure that I'm not telling any of you anything you don't already know, but we've had a lot of trouble collecting data beyond the anecdotal, like getting Twitter messages or Instagram messages about who's actually listening. For us, our intended audience is sort of a general one, but from what we hear back from our listeners, we get used mostly in academic settings in like high school and college classrooms for teaching purposes, that's great. And you know, part of the reason we started our podcast was because we were all teaching in our own little bubbles about sort of critical approaches to race, and found like the people who came into those classes were already primed to hear that information. And because there's important social justice implications of this stuff, we wanted to get it out to a wider audience of people who might not self-select into our college classrooms on, you know, critical approaches to understanding race and its history. So that's good news to us. But in terms of the disciplinary identity of our folks, I really don't know. Our professional associations sponsor us and highlight us, so that's good too, but there's a kind of a black box there, and I wonder if others have also experienced that.
Amanda?
Yeah, I agree with what Joe said. It's so difficult tracking these things. For us, it was maybe a touch easier only because we had the NEH funding. So that kind of, we had a little bit of help from the NEH, which is a lot of help actually, I should say. But like we know a lot of our audience came from the Health Humanities Consortium, because the first episode we did was called What is the Health Humanities, which was sort of what is this field? But that was also used in a couple of classes. So, and that came from feedback from people who said, are you going to do another version of this? But we also got feedback from unexpected audiences. So my intended audience was probably largely academic, to be honest. A lot of people working in the health humanities. The podcast was spun out of a summer lecture series, a webinar series that was also funded through the grant that I hosted that was on COVID-19 in the humanities. And so we figured some of the audience from that group might carry through because we advertised it through the last episode. But we had sort of general listeners. And I hate to say the phrase random listeners, but sort of random listeners. So an administrative assistant in a PT program at another university. And for me, that's sort of a random connection. And I know because she reached out and kept saying, when are you going to have more episodes? We know that the voting and your health episode had a lot of interest actually from non-academic circles. And again, it's because people reached out and asked about it. So yeah, it's hard to know for certain, but interestingly enough, the audience ended up being perhaps bigger than we intended. And I think it was partly the topics we chose as well. Another one was on the alleged report of forcible sterilization in ICE detention center in Georgia. The people who were on that episode also wrote an editorial about that. So there was sort of that circulation through both the editorial and the episode. So we ended up having a decently broad audience, I'd say. But as Joe pointed out, it's really hard to know numbers for sure. I have some numbers and then I have these other numbers, and all I can do is kind of ballpark to some extent.
Yeah, and so intended audience and actual audience, it can be really hard to know, right? If you're targeting the people that you thought you were targeting, or if suddenly you've become more interesting to other groups. Sharon, I think, had their hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, actually, or slightly shift the question a little bit for folks. I mean, one of the things that I found fascinating about working on the podcast was the way that I started listening differently. And I worked with interviews that were initially Zoom interviews, so they were video material, and then transforming them into something that I was listening to. I mean, listening to dreams is a whole other topic, but it changed. It's not just a question of audience. I guess what I'm asking is how your relationship to the material changed by doing it in a podcast form. I was thinking, for example, of Jo, like, I mean, does race then become, not de facto, but does it, in the podcast, did it become a question of sound, of the way that voices are racialized, or other sounds become racialized? You know what I mean? Like, I'm just wondering about that question too.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a
And
shift.
that gets to another thing that we said we were going to talk about, so we can transition perhaps, and maybe we'll come back to audience later as we organically move through this. But another thing we were talking about is what advantages or challenges or just interesting things happen when you do interdisciplinary research in this medium, right? So this idea of the kinds of topics that you're exploring specifically through podcast form, if you can talk about the intersection of that, which I think is kind of what Sharon's question to Jo is partially getting at. Jo?
Okay, can you?
Or anyone.
I feel like I need a bit more primer to give you a coherent answer about this. So Sharon, I think I understood what you were saying. Jill, could you give me like a 1-sentence soundbite?
Yeah. One of the things I think I took from Sharon was this idea that if we're talking about the social construction of race, but we're doing it in podcast form, then what becomes salient is more kind of a sound quality rather than perhaps other ways we might talk about race, and whether that's something that might have happened or something that might have changed your relationship to the subject matter. I think that's kind of what Sharon was getting at. And of course, the idea of changing relationship to the subject matter could happen in a lot of places. Like Aliz has already talked about how the intention in making the podcast kind of shifted over time as they were working on it. So, oh, and Elizabeth has a hand up too. So maybe we'll go there first because she has something to say about this. Yeah.
That was fast. Yeah, well, I was just thinking generally about this question of what difference does it make that it's audio to these kinds of, to the research that we're doing, or to the book that we're interviewing about, or to the topic that we're discussing, which I think is part of your question, one dimension. And I mean, one aspect of it is, and this isn't so much about the sonic quality or the technology, but about the kind of maybe cultural, the genre of conversation and the genre of speaking, as opposed to writing or mounting an exhibit or other things, that there's something about, I mean, what John and I have found in you know, talking, for instance, about, we had an episode about the Capitol attack, because I was speaking with a friend on January 6th. We were trying to put in a proposal together. He's a historian of Brazil, and he, in particular, he studies this thing called the Taylor's Rebellion, which was accused of seditious conspiracy. And so we sort of started, you know, while freaking out, we also started talking about sedition, and that kind of ended up being an episode about that. And it was, you know, so this was his research. He knows a lot more about it than I do, from the sort of legal and historical perspectives. But it was sort of within this oral genre, and it kind of naturally came out of us talking, you know, about this, and that kind of gave it a certain sense of freedom and a certain way, you know, the podcast that I like listening to, and also what I like doing about podcasting is that, you know, I mean, I hope that I'm not trying to sound dilettantish, but, you know, you don't necessarily have to have read about something for 2 years and kind of be really committing yourself to a peer-reviewed publication. Of course, one wants to be responsible and thoughtful, but there's something about that kind of effect of immediacy. And I think it is also a kind of cultural dimension of speaking that allows you to have different kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And some friends of mine who work a lot in podcast studies have also talked about kind of the intimate nature of the conversation as opposed to like reading an academic journal. And that a lot of people listen to these like in earbuds, right? So you're walking around kind of and the possible parasocial relationships that might come from that. That it is kind of not just a different way for you, the researcher or podcast producer, to share your information or knowledge, but also a different relationship that you could develop with the audience. And some of you, when talking about audience, talked about like how you might be able to know who it was because people are messaging you, which I think people might feel freer to do, messaging podcast hosts than messaging the author of an academic journal. Like they feel like they know you a little bit better, perhaps because of this sound relationship. Joe, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, there's a corner of people in the small corner of people in the world who are kind of working academically and publishing wise at the intersection of what we're trying to do on the podcast. But there's little, if any, real-time kind of discussion going on around history of science, human biology, and culture and race. And so, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest advantages of us doing the podcast in this way is, maybe this is stating the obvious, right? But people get to hear us sort of grappling in real time around questions of interdisciplinarity and also having a rapport with one another. We all knew each other before we started the podcast. And one of the things we often hear is from our listeners is that we sound like we're having fun when we talk to each other. And we do. But on the flip side of that, I think it also becomes very difficult because we have a sort of bantery, rapport, casual approach to doing our podcast. It becomes difficult to have the work that we're doing on the podcast taken seriously as academic work, which I know is something that others probably struggle with too. So two of us have gone up for promotion during the 4 years that our podcast has been running, and I don't think for either one of us the podcast counted as anything more than just a nice aside, whereas we really were generating research, original research, and presenting it on the podcast. And so that's something that is a bit off topic perhaps, but is kind of perhaps the dark side of how much rapport and sort of approachability, I think, comes out of the podcast medium.
I think that's a theme of a lot of the sessions I've been to in HPN is how to get this like recognized in the academy and stuff like that.
Yeah, I've heard it talked about in other sessions here too. It's been really nice.
Come up in a lot of places. Yeah. I was wondering if we can also talk about maybe some of the challenges and opportunities that come specifically with these interdisciplinary engagements and interdisciplinary research. So many of you on the panel work with somebody who's in another discipline, or if not partnering with somebody, are interviewing people across various different disciplines. So what can you tell me about what's challenging and or rewarding? Sometimes the challenging is the rewarding, but can you speak about the challenges about that? Aliz.
Yeah, okay, I can start. I can take this question. So yeah, this was another question that I thought about a lot when I was preparing for this roundtable. And the more I think about this, the more I get to the conclusion that it might be tempting to say that if you go interdisciplinary, that means that you have to kind of go out of your comfort zone, and that itself is a challenge, or at least it's tempting to consider this a challenge. But on the other hand, I feel like I would rather consider this more of an opportunity rather than a challenge, and an opportunity to learn or to network, because sometimes this is a good way for me to talk to people who otherwise it would be quite difficult to reach. And it's also another thing that I think this is more of an opportunity, is because this is a really good way to check for accessibility. So I think when it comes to interdisciplinary discussions, I think the question of access comes up quite often, and especially if we have a diverse audience, we have to make sure that what we talk about these actually go through to the audience, and they can follow the conversation. So, and I noticed that if I talk to people who are in the same field as I am, then sometimes it's, because we are both familiar with the topic, we might kind of forget about defining certain basic concepts because we think that it's natural and it's obvious, everybody understands it. But if we talk to someone who's in a completely different field, you might realize that, okay, even I'm not necessarily familiar with those concepts. So even if I prepare for the conversation, so sometimes I find myself, if I talk to someone who's in a very different field, then I find myself not becoming, well, I find myself in a different role as the host. So in a sense that I don't necessarily become someone like, almost like a member of the audience, but somehow like a mediator. And I notice that I sometimes ask different kinds of questions. So I ask them to define certain very basic concepts that may be trivial to them, but at the same time, they're not necessarily trivial to me or to the audience. But at the same time, I also notice that these kinds of conversations can be sometimes revelatory to the guest as well, because they realize that, okay, so this is how an outsider perceives me. This is what is obvious to them, and sometimes they realize that, oh, even these basic concepts are not necessarily clear to others. So it might be useful for them as well to reconsider how they present their work to others. So this can be a useful kind of platform for communication and conversation for both sides, for me as well and for them too.
Thanks for that, Aliz. I found that really interesting. And while I haven't done interdisciplinary podcasting, it also kind of echoed some of the things I learned in interdisciplinary education. So when I first entered into working with a team of other professors who came across from a variety of disciplines, one of my mentors kind of said, okay, so the first thing you have to know is it's okay if you don't know everything. You don't have, which as a young graduate student, like, or fresh postdoc or whatever, I felt like I needed to know everything in the classroom. And that was completely impossible. And like, it's impossible anyway, but it's completely impossible in an interdisciplinary setting. And I found it kind of freeing to be able to learn rather than to have to claim to be the expert. So that's one thing I find really valuable about interdisciplinary work and education in general. Any other specifically maybe challenges that any of you have faced in working in these interdisciplinary spaces, negotiating things with people coming from other backgrounds or other disciplines? No one has any challenges. I'm amazed, and that's awesome.
I do. I'm just trying not to talk too much. So I want to turn it over to somebody else and then I'll hop back in.
Okay. Then I might ask a specific question about this coordination that Sharon talked about. So this is another kind of interdisciplinary move, the coordination between dreams and the composer. And I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that connection.
Yes, I guess I can. It's been so fun to develop a musical language with the composer that will suit our podcast. I think is a bit different. We're not it's not a chatty guest podcast. It's structured quite differently. That takes us an enormous amount of effort actually to get 15 minutes. It's huge labor differently in between editing and developing the sound. Which is partly why my question to Jo, because I've been thinking so much about sound and what it just means to kind of move away from, a visual medium and how that changes listening practices and structures of relation. But to your question, Jill, I think working with the composer has totally transformed how I listen to dreams. Like he'll do things like he'll hear attention, one of the dreamers that I'll be taking little bits of the clip, and they'll be talking away and there'll be tension in the way that the person is speaking about something. And he'll pair the chord structure to hold the tension and then release it as soon as someone says something that they themselves he feels emotionally has been released. And he did a really sweet thing with the 9-year-old who had a dream about going back into her mother's womb every time there was a lockdown. And so he reversed this, as she was telling that dream, he reversed some of the, he did a kind of play on one of Gabriele Fauré's pieces, and he reversed it so that the structure of the musical line would reverse every time she talked about going back in the womb. Like, it was very just like beautiful, beautiful things that, you know, only a composer can really do. So, but he talking with him about how he was working that way and had transformed how I listened to people. And, you know, I would sort of hang on the resonance of what a single word, all of its kind of valences might mean, and just take time. I try to make space for quiet in the podcast too, so that people could hear what they might have listened to, so there was a bit of time to digest it. So, yeah.
That's really cool. I really like the idea of holding the tension, especially since like auditory and smell are so connected to our memories and our processing this. And I wonder if we can extend this too to the idea of using like sound effects more generally. And I just think that whole idea of like sound representation and the physical affect that can have is just really interesting, and not something I was trained in basically at all. And again, not something you get through other mediums of interdisciplinary research, to come back to kind of what we gain when we move into this more auditory medium, which I think is really, really cool. Yeah. So any other examples of kind of challenges or opportunities or different perspectives that any of you have gained as you're working through your various interdisciplinary projects?
Well, I'll just say that the way that we've conducted the podcast, you know, as I mentioned earlier, it sort of grew out of our own individual teaching that each of us was doing at the time around this topic. We all were at the same institution, and we were the only people in the entire college, as far as we could tell, who were at the time teaching courses around critical approaches to race. And it certainly fed back into the way that I teach. In fact, I structured a new course around the content of the podcast when I moved to my current institution, and I use it a lot in teaching. So being able to learn from my colleagues, in the case of Erik, history, so a little bit of history of science, and in the case of Jim, a little more human biology than I used to know, has profoundly shaped the way that I teach. I'm not sure if that's quite in line with what you're asking, but it certainly has done that for me.
No, I think that would fall into something that I think is a bonus or an opportunity. And I'm also wondering, there are a number of panelists who are working not just interdisciplinary, but with humanities and another type of faculty, right? So Amanda, we've got humanities and connection to medical health, bringing in people from there, or we've got humanities and social sciences in the case of Joe and Elizabeth, I believe. And so I'm also wondering about the challenge there. So working within the humanist tradition, you might think that there are maybe some similarities, maybe not. But as you step outside and go to other faculties, what's salient or important may shift, right? And so you may have not necessarily clashes, but potential things that need to be worked through as you do that. Elizabeth, I see your hand up.
Yeah, that's I'm sort of trying to formulate this. I mean, yeah, not clashes, but like hitches. And I notice this especially, you know, so our podcast, you know, we also get artists and scientists, but I would say that the bulk of the guests are either humanists or social scientists, usually in the more humanistic social sciences. And but there's like more difference than I realize often between even the humanistic social sciences and the humanities. And I'm from a family of humanists. Both my parents were English professors. Yeah, sometimes I mean I often notice it, like if it's a sort of John and the guest who are in the humanities, and I'll ask a question and it's like does not land, right? And to me, it seems like a question that is very self-evident, right? And then I can see it also if we have, say, an anthropologist or a sociologist or a geographer on, and John will say something, and I can just see this sort of momentary blankness of like, that wasn't the question I thought was going to come at all. And this is sort of what I was saying at the beginning. I just find that so interesting. Like, even sort of things like what gets to count as an example, or what is your, like, if you're talking about a small thing as an evidence of a particular cultural moment, right? How are you thinking about the relationship? Like, are you saying that this cultural moment is causing a particular kind of novelistic genre, say? Or are you saying that it's a microcosm of it? And like, that seems like a very normal question for an anthropologist to ask. And it's like totally did not seem like the question that was expected. But that in itself is super interesting, right? Like or to me it is anyways, like how are people encountering their, I mean, we would call it data, right? But like the things that they study, what are they supposed to be telling you? Like, are they telling you just about themselves, or are they telling you about some larger thing, and in what way? And so those questions come up, and they often come up when there's kind of like a mismatch, but they sort of lead to interesting things.
Yeah. And following off of that, I also feel like sometimes some of the mismatch comes down to not necessarily understanding the research methods or background assumptions that people make in other disciplines. And so recently, one in my own work that came up was I got introduced to the idea of autoethnography from anthropology, which I knew nothing about and did not know, how it's supposed to be presented or what the research methods are. And I was asked questions about this, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know how this works at all. I'm fascinated, but I don't know what makes a good autoethnography. And so these are things that I expect perhaps are a little bit different when you're looking at podcasting, but the idea of background methods and background assumptions, how do you deal with that?
If I can jump in and add on that, I thought what was fascinating for me is coming out of the humanities, I'm sort of used to this public defense of our importance that we're kind of constantly doing, of we're relevant and here's why. And I sort of assumed some of the other disciplines would not feel that way. And that was a false assumption. So even when I was dealing with doctors, they felt like they had to justify their existence in a way that I said, you're a physician, by the nature of you being a physician, no one questions this. And of course they did. And so it was interesting to see sort of the vulnerabilities of each discipline, that actually there was a lot of connection there that I did not expect. And part of it was the nature of the research people were doing. I was asking them to kind of bring in things that are more on the humanities side, but part of it was just this sort of insecurity that I think is built into some of the research we're doing, or people who were not researchers, but are, I'm thinking of the healthcare lobbyist who was on the show, a different discipline, and what does it mean to be sort of this pseudo-academic setting of this podcast. But the other interesting challenge was critique, right? So if I asked a question about maybe the limitations of the discipline in investigating whatever topic, there was a lot of, I can critique my own discipline, but you don't get to critique my discipline. And it was a defensiveness that I didn't anticipate either, because again, coming out of literature, like all we do is critique, I feel, in a lot of ways. So we're very used to saying, okay, where are the problems and how do we address them? And so trying to phrase those questions in a way that I didn't disarm my guest to the point that I lost the interview, but could still say, okay, how we can do some great reflection on this. And the advantage I had was because it was a narrative-based podcast, I could edit out some of the awkwardness. But yeah, the rough cuts there's some interesting exchanges where there's some silence and the Zoom, we did it via Zoom, you can see faces going, I don't know if we're going to continue down this line. So I think trying to make the guests feel comfortable, but also be critical at the same time, particularly given some of the topics we were discussing, was a challenge, certainly.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, this idea that like I get to critique my own discipline and our research methods and background assumptions, but you can't critique it from the outside. Cool. Okay, so I think that's more or less what we had lined up to talk about. Oh, Jo has her hand up, and then maybe after that, we'll also look through the chat and take comments from the audience and questions as well. Jo?
Yeah, just really quickly, one of the ways in which I think our different disciplinary divides plague us a little bit on the podcast is that some of us are more focused on sort of like the overall arc of what we want to say, and some of us are more focused on the data and the information. And so it's it's a bit of a struggle at times for us to balance those two things, but we kind of just duke it out when we conceive our episodes and write a rough script. We usually have somebody who's plugging in, like, here's the information that we want to convey. And then we have somebody else who is making it into kind of a bit more of a story. And that, I feel like it's a challenge, but it's a productive one.
Often these sites of tension can be really, really fruitful if we are able to stay with the tension, but that sometimes causes its own interpersonal issues. So I'm looking at the chat. Kim had a question or a comment from a while ago about maybe wanting to revisit this question about sound and race and the racialization of sound. And that also made me think of things like African-American English, or also there's a great essay, and I'm completely blanking on the author's name, which I feel terrible about. The person who wrote the Joy Luck Club wrote a really great essay about mother tongue, talking about the ways in which sounds and accents get stigmatized. So yeah, that's something. Amy Tan, thank you so much. It's been quite a Saturday morning for me in some ways. Thank you so much. So yeah, there's that question that we may want to revisit. And then also the idea of this kind of borders or physical anxieties is something that I think people are really interested in too. So do we want to talk about, Joe, do you have any other thoughts about that sound and race and racialization?
Yeah, I mean, we, podcast wise, the three hosts of this podcast all are white, and that's something that's challenging, I think, given that we're talking about race. And so one of the ways that we try to, increase the representation of folks in our, from various ethnic, racial, and otherwise backgrounds is to invite people from diverse backgrounds onto the podcast. And because I mean, we sometimes find ourselves, at least I do, in this slightly odd position of then being the person who's sound editing the podcast after the fact. And we simply try to approach it, I would say, by allowing people's own ways of speaking to shine through. We're not attempting, when we do our post-production, to sort of sanitize people's speech. And, I think that's important, especially given the topic that we're dealing with, that we don't attempt to do that.
Yeah, and I think that also calls back to some things I've heard in other sessions about the ethics of editing and preserving authentic voice and all that kind of stuff. So I guess I'll just officially thank everybody for attending at the end of a 2-day fabulous workshop where we may all be getting Zoom fatigue. I found this really, really helpful and interesting. I hope other people got some ideas or learned something, sparked something. Thanks, everybody.
Congratulations.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.